Okay. So what does Grant do? Um, what one of the key insights that he's got his army, about 44,000 Union soldiers, across the Mississippi into the state of Mississippi. And one of the things that Grant had decided is that they didn't need to take a lot of supplies with them, especially food. Of course, they needed guns, they needed ammunition. There was no doubt about that. But Grant, remember I talked about in the earlier podcast that in this kind of this the first attempt to take Vicksburg, which happened in late 1862 and early 1863, had been a fiasco. That Grant had noticed how rich the land was in Mississippi, that there was still crops being grown, still plenty of horses, cattle, and hogs. So what Grant does, and this is one of the things that really shocks his subordinates, and one of the things that really worries them, when he crosses the 44,000 men into Mississippi, they only take basically ammunition with them. They take very, very little food because Grant has decided he can cut himself off from his supply line. The supply line had always been a problem, right? Because if you live with your supply line, Confederate cavalry had turned out to be very, very adept at chopping up the supply line. So Grant says, "Well, screw the supply line. I'll just take food from the civilians that are in my path. There's plenty of food to be had. I'll let my army live off the land." And so this is what he did. And he's really thinking, this was not going by the book in doing this. So he's really being very, very inventive in this, in thinking in this way. So what Grant has to do is he wants to take Vicksburg, but before he can take Vicksburg, he has to capture the capital of Mississippi, which is Jackson, Mississippi. And the reason for that is that the reason he can't go straight up to Vicksburg is that if he lay siege to Vicksburg without capturing Jackson first, Confederate troops could have attacked him from the rear. And if you're looking at this map, this will probably make a lot more sense than listening to me talk about it. So, what Grant has to do is he has to capture Jackson first before he can capture Vicksburg. And if you're looking at the map, and the URL says Bob Civil War History, you'll see that Jackson is also a railroad center, and that the Confederate Army, if Grant had not captured it first, the Confederate Army could have sent a bunch of troops to Jackson via railroad and then attacked Grant's army from the rear, and Grant would have been quite vulnerable. So what Grant does is, after he crosses into Mississippi, instead of going up to Vicksburg first, he goes, and on May 14th, he captures Jackson, Mississippi. And he destroys the railroads in Jackson, Mississippi, and he neutralizes Jackson, so he can't be attacked from the rear. So what the first thing he does is, after he gets into the state of Mississippi, he goes and he captures Jackson, this railroad center. And then he turns towards Vicksburg, and he fights a couple of battles on his way to Vicksburg. But ultimately, by May 18th, 1863, Grant has laid siege to Vicksburg. And he starts surrounding Vicksburg with Union soldiers. And at this point, he's able to open up his supply line because he owns the interior of Mississippi. So again, to repeat, once Grant gets his army across the Mississippi River into Mississippi, the first objective is to capture Jackson and destroy the railroads there and to neutralize Jackson. And then he turns his attention to Vicksburg. He gets to Vicksburg. He fights a battle there, and he is not able to capture Vicksburg right away because the defenses around Vicksburg are too expertly built. The Southern Army has high morale, and again, we run into something that you start running into at this point in the Civil War. it was relatively easy for the Confederate Army to fight a defensive war because Confederate soldiers could kill Union soldiers with rifled bullets at at a range of up to 500 yards. So Grant, when he turns to Vicksburg after taking Jackson, he's not able to capture it immediately or initially, but really Vicksburg, the time is up, the clock is ticking. So what you have at Vicksburg is a siege of Vicksburg that starts on May 18th, 1863, and ends with the Confederate surrender on July 4th, 1863, which happens just a day after the end of the Battle of Gettysburg. So hopefully now, if you've been listening to this podcast, you'll get a sense that Grant's not thinking about Gettysburg. He's not thinking about Pennsylvania. He's not thinking about Lee or anything of the sort. He's super focused on Vicksburg. And so it's a coincidence that Vicksburg surrenders on July 4th, 1863, the day after the Battle of Gettysburg. It's not part of any grand plan on the part of the Union Army. So Grant captures Vicksburg. Very quickly, he captures this place called Port Hudson, which is south of Vicksburg, which is a smaller fort that had stopped Union boats from heading north. But long story short, with the capture of Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863, what you have is the Confederacy is split in two. The railroad that went through Vicksburg is now in Union hands. The interior of the state of Mississippi is now in Union hands. Goods from the north, places like Illinois, Indiana, can now flow down the Mississippi River unimpeded to New Orleans, and from New Orleans, these goods can go out really anywhere in the world that a ship can sail. And so the capture of Vicksburg, and remember, Sherman had said it was worth 40 Richmonds, is a really key moment in the history of the Civil War. It's a major achievement in the final defeat of the South, although do remember that even with the twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Civil War will not end until April 1865. There's a lot more fighting and a lot more dying that's going to happen after Gettysburg and Vicksburg. So the war is not over yet. But clearly, after early July of 1863, militarily speaking anyway, the North has gained the upper hand. One last thing, Lincoln, in one of his great quotes, of course he was thrilled at Grant's victory. He said, Grant is mine and I am his for the rest of the war. His confidence in Grant really paid off. But in one of Lincoln's more beautiful and pithy phrases, he said, "The father of all waters now runs unvexed to the sea." And of course, that's the supposedly anyway the Indian name for the Mississippi River, the father of all waters. So again, after the capture of Vicksburg, Grant writes someone, "The father of all waters now runs unvexed to the sea." I love that word, unvexed. We don't use the word vex enough. Anyway, okay, that's today's lecture.